The paper bag was scrunched up inside Allison's purse, and it was pitch dark. The students and the Nanogen man sat huddled. "I can't tell if she means to help us or not," Ken King said. "She's obviously terrified of Drake," Peter said. "Who wouldn't be?" Amal said. Rick had sighed. "I told you Drake was a corporate slime. Nobody listened." "Shut up, damn you," Kevin yelled at him. "Hey, please," Amal said in a very calm voice. "Not now." "Sorry," Kevin said. Then she added, "But we're not dealing with an ordinary slime. We're dealing with a very sick man." She fingered her knife. It was useless as a defense. It might not even break Drake's skin. There came a banging, thunderous noise, and the bag shook, and light suddenly glowed through the bag. The purse had been opened. Then, with a slamming noise, everything went dark again. They waited, wondering what would come next. The students, Allison's Bender knew, had to be put back in the generator and restored to full size, and quickly. But she didn't know how to operate the generator herself. The workday was long over, and almost all the employees had gone home, leaving Nanogen deserted. She found Drake back in the animal room. He had finished talking with the police officers, and now he was searching the animal room carefully, looking into every corner and cabinet, peering into every cage. He stared at her, his eyes hard. "Did you let them go?" "No, I swear, Vin. I'm going to have this lab cleaned tomorrow. The animals put to death, the whole room sterilized with gas, then washed with bleach." That's good, Vin. "We don't have any choice." He touched her arm. "Go home and get some rest. I'm going to stay here for a while." She gave him a grateful look. Then she hurried into her office, picked up her purse, and headed outdoors. Marisol had gone home. The reception area was empty. A fat moon drifted in stars dusting the sky. A beautiful night if only her mind hadn't been in turmoil. She got into the BMW. It was a corporate car for her use. She put the purse on the seat next to her and sped off. Ben Drake went into the deserted lobby, keeping himself in the shadows. When he heard Allison's car start and go down the street, he ran outdoors to the Bentley and started it. Where were her taillights? He got to the Farrington Highway. Left or right? He swung left. The way to Honolulu. The most likely way she'd go. He pulled out into traffic and accelerated, feeling his body pressed into the seat with a surge of power. There it was, the red BMW traveling fast. He dropped back, watching her taillights. Her car turned onto the entry ramp to the H1 freeway. The midnight blue Bentley faded into the night. He was just another set of headlights behind her in the flow of traffic. He had not been able to find the students. There was only one possibility. Allison had taking them with her in her car. He couldn't be completely sure of it, but his instincts told him so. She might have to go. He certainly couldn't trust her. That was obvious. The woman had lost her nerve. But it was getting complicated. All these people disappearing. Alison Bender was Nenigen's chief financial officer. And if she disappeared now, it would provoke a very thorough investigation. He didn't want that. An investigation of Nenigen would sooner or later turn up something he had done. It was inevitable. Enough time, enough checking. They would find out. No. He didn't want an investigation. He began to realize he had made a terrible mistake. He couldn't kill her. He couldn't afford to kill her. At least, not right now. He needed her on his side for a little while. How could he get her on his side? Alison followed the freeway around Pearl Harbor, trying not to look at her purse on the seat. Maybe Vin was right. Maybe there was no choice. She exited into downtown Honolulu, not certain where to go. She drove to Waikiki. There she went slowly along Karakua Avenue, caught in traffic. The crowds of tourists were thick, people out for the evening. Then she turned onto Diamond Head Road and circled past the Diamond Head Lighthouse. She would take the paper bag to a beach somewhere on the windward side of Oahu, or maybe to the North Shore. She would drop the bag in the surf somewhere. No evidence, no survivors. Drake stayed back, watching her car. She went past Makapu'u Point and through Waimanalo and Kailua, but then she turned and picked up the freeway and headed back toward Honolulu. Where in hell was his CFO going, he wondered. Having driven around the eastern edge of Oahu and doubled back into Honolulu, Alison finally found herself following the Manoa Valley Road, winding up into the rainforested valley among the mountains. She arrived at the steel gates and the tunnel. The gates were locked. She punched the security code and went through. The tunnel emerged into a velvet dark valley. The place was deserted, the greenhouses glinting faintly in the moonlight. She opened her purse and took the bag out of it. And got out of the car. She didn't dare open the bag. They were probably dead by now, crushed or suffocated. But what if they weren't? What if they started pleading with her? That would be worse than if they were dead. She stood in the parking lot, headlights coming out of the tunnel. Somebody had followed her. She stood there, holding the bag, frozen in terror, caught in the headlights of the corporate Bentley. Chapter 11. Waipaka Arboretum, 28 October, 10:45 p.m. "What are you doing here, Alison?" Drake said, getting out of the Bentley. He kept the headlights burning on her. She blinked in the glare. Why did you follow me? I'm worried about you, Allison. Very worried. I'm fine. We have a lot to do, approaching her. What? She shrank back. We have to protect ourselves. Sharp intake of breath. What are you planning? He couldn't allow the blame to fall on himself. On her, but not on himself. He had begun to form an idea. There was a way to get this done. There is a reason for their disappearance, you know, he said to her. What are you talking about, Vin? A plausible reason why they vanish. A reason other than you and me. What's the reason? Alcohol. What? He grabbed her hand and dragged her toward the greenhouse, saying, They're penurious students. No money. Always trying to save their pennies. They want to have a party, get wasted, but they don't have any money. So where do poor science students go when they want to get wasted for free? Where? The lab, of course. He unlocked the door, flicked on the lights. The bulbs came on in banks overhead. One after another, down the long expanse of the lab, revealing benches of exotic plants, potted orchids beneath hanging mist makers, and in the corner, shelf after shelf of bottles and jugs full of reagents. He pulled out a plastic gallon jug labeled 98% ethanol. What's that? She said. Lab alcohol, he said. Is that your idea? Yes, he said. You buy vodka or tequila at a store. You get 78, 70, 80, 90 proof. This stuff here is double that. It's 196 proof. It's almost pure alcohol. And Vin was picking up plastic cups, handing them to her. Alcohol causes car accidents, especially among young people. She groaned. Vin? He was watching her carefully. Okay, let's call a spade, he said. You don't have the stomach for it. Well, no. And neither do I. That's the truth. She blinked, confused. You don't? No, I don't. I can't stand this, Allison. I don't want to go through with this, he said. I don't want this on my conscience. Then what will we do? She said. He allowed a look of doubt, of uncertainty, to fill his face. I don't know, he said, shaking his head mournfully. Probably we never should have started this. And now, I just don't know. He hoped his expression of uncertainty was convincing. He knew he could be convincing. He paused, then reached down and took her hand, and held it up to the light. In her hand was the paper bag, rolled up. They're in there, aren't they? What do you want me to do? Her hand was shaking. Go outside and wait for me, he said. I need a few minutes to think. We have to come up with a solution to this, Allison. No more killing. Let Allison kill them, even if she doesn't know she's killing them. She nodded silently. I need your help, Allison. I will, she said. I'll help you. I will. Thank you, heartfelt. She went outside. He entered the greenhouse and went to a storage cabinet, where he found a box of nitrile safety gloves. Tough lab gloves, stronger than rubber. He pulled out 2 gloves and stuffed them in his pocket. Then he hurried into a side office and turned on the surveillance monitor overlooking the parking lot. It was a night vision camera, flaring green and black. Of course, everything was recorded. He watched as Allison went outside and stood near the cars, looking at the bag and pacing. He could almost see the idea forming in her mind. Do it, Vin whispered. The field teams had horrendous problems. 4 employees had died in Fern Gully alone, and they had been heavily armed. And there was the problem of the bends. These kids wouldn't last an hour in this biological hell. After that, it would be a matter of getting Allison on his side temporarily. She was walking away from the cars. Yes, towards the forest. Yes. She went downhill, following the trail down into Fern Gully. Good. Keep going. On the monitor, her shape faded into the blackness. She was going down slope, down into the depths of the forest. He lost track of her. Then a star-like point of light came on. She had a flashlight. She turned it on. Now he watched the light as it went back and forth, getting fainter. She was zigzagging on a switchback trail. The deeper into biological hell, the better. Suddenly, he heard a scream, panicked shrieks, coming from the darkness of the forest. Christ! He turned away from the monitor and ran outdoors. Even though the moon was up, in the depths of the rainforest, it was so dark it was hard to see her. He hurried down the trail, stumbling and slipping, heading toward her flashlight, and heard her saying, I don't know. Her voice soft in the gloom. She was shining the beam around. Allison, he paused, waiting for his eyes to adjust. What don't you know? I don't know what happened. She was a dark shape holding the bag out in front of her, as if it was an offering from a dark god. I don't know how they got away. Here, look. She shone the flashlight on the bag. He saw a jagged cut running along the bottom of the bag. It was a fine cut. One of them had a knife, he said. I guess. And they jumped or fell. I guess, yes. Where? Right around here. I first noticed it here. I haven't moved since. I didn't want to step on them. I wouldn't worry about that. They're probably dead already. He took her flashlight, crouched down, strung it along the tops of the ferns. He was looking for disturbances in the shimmering dew that coated the ferns. He saw nothing. She started to cry. It's not your fault, Allison. I know, sobbing. I was going to let them go. I figured. I'm sorry. but I was going to do it. Vin put his arm around her. Not your fault, Allison. That's what matters. Did you see any sign of them with the flashlight? No. He shook his head. It's a big fall, and they don't have much mass. They could have been blown a considerable distance. Then they might still be. They might, yes, but it's doubtful. We should look for them. But at night, Allison, we might step on them by accident. We can't just leave them here. You know, the fall almost certainly killed them. Now I believe you, Allison, when you tell me that you didn't cut the bag open and dump them out. What are you saying? But the police may not believe your story so readily. You could already be implicated in Eric's death, and now this, dumping those kids in the most dangerous place, intentionally. That's murder, Allison. Well, you'll tell the police the truth. Of course, he said. But why should they believe me either? The fact is, Allison, we have only one way to go here, and that is to continue on the plan we started. Their disappearance has to be explained as an accident. Then if they reappear miraculously later on, well, Hawaii is a magical place. Wonderful place. Miracles happen here. She stood very still in the darkness. We should just leave them. We can look tomorrow in daylight. He squeezed her shoulder, pulled her close to him. He shone the flashlight down. Here, let's follow the path. We can see what's ahead, and we can leave safely. Then we'll come back tomorrow. But right now, we have to deal with the car, okay? One thing at a time, Allison. Still sobbing, she allowed herself to be led out of the forest. Back to the parking lot. Vin Drake checked his watch. It was 11:14 p.m. There was still time to carry out the next stage of his plan. Chapter 12. Waipaka Arboretum, 28 October, 11 o'clock p.m. The students were jostled inside the paper bag. Every movement of Allison's magnified and accompanied by a loud rasping sound as they scraped back and forth across the paper. Peter never realized that ordinarily brown paper was so rough. It felt almost like sandpaper to his skin. He saw that the others had all managed to face inward, so they didn't abrade their faces as they slid back and forth. They had been driven somewhere, and it had taken a long time. But where were they? And what would be done to them? It was hard to talk as they fell this way and that, and it difficult to come up with a plan when everybody was talking at the same time. The Nergin man, Jarrell Kinski, kept repeating that there had been some mistake. If there was some way I could talk with Mr. Drake, Kinski said. Get over it, King snapped at him. But I can't believe Mr. Drake would just kill us, Kinski said. Oh, really? Karen said. Kinski didn't answer. The bigger problem was that they didn't know what Vin or Allison were up to. They had been driven around in a car, but where had the car ended up? It made no sense. Then Vin and Allison seemed to reach an agreement. Their exact conversation was impossible to follow, and Allison carried the bag outdoors into darkness. "What's this?" Karen King said, alarmed, as they were carried along. "What's going on?" They heard a booming sound. It was a snuffle. Allison Bender. "I have the feeling she wants to save us," Peter Jansen said. "Vin will never allow it," Karen said. "I know." "I think we better take things into our own hands," Karen said. She produced her knife, unfolded it. "Now hold on," Danny Minot said. "This is a decision we have to reach together." "I don't know about that," Karen said, "'cause I've got the knife." "Don't be a child," Minot said. "Don't be a coward. We act or they act on us and they kill us. Which is it?" She didn't wait for Danny to answer. She turned to Peter. "How far above ground do you think we are right now?" "I don't know. Maybe 4.5 feet. 137 centimeters, Erica Mole said. "And what's our mass?" Peter laughed. "Not very much." "You're laughing," Danny Minot said, amazed. "You people are insane. Compared to our normal size, a drop of 4.5 feet is the equivalent of 450 feet, Erica said. "Say, the height of a 45-story building. And no, this would not be the equivalent of a fall from a 45-story building." "Of course it would," Danny said. "Isn't it great when the science studies people don't know any science?" Erica said. Peter explained. "It's a little issue of air resistance." "No, that doesn't matter," Danny said, through clenched teeth, clearly stung by the criticism. "Because objects fall in a gravitational field at the same rate irrespective of mass. A penny and a piano fall at the same rate, hit the ground at the same time." "Nothing can be done for him," Karen said. "And we have to make a decision now." The jostling in the bag had slowed. Allison was making up her mind to do something. "I don't think the distance we fall matters very much," Peter Jansen said. He had been trying to figure out the physics of being very small. It was all about gravity and inertia. Peter said, "What's important is Newton's equation for..." "Enough. I say we jump," Karen interrupted. "Jump," Jenny said. "Jump," Amar said. "Oh, God," Danny moaned. "But we don't know where we are." "Jump," Erica said. "This is our only chance," Shikada said. "Jump." "Jump," Peter said. "Okay," Karen said. "I'm going to run along this seam at the bottom and cut it open. Try to stay close together. Imagine you're skydivers. Arms and legs ride. A human kite. Here we go." "But just a minute," Danny yelled. "Too late," Karen shouted. "Good luck." Peter felt her brush past him, the knife in her hand, and a moment later, the paper bag tilted beneath his feet. and he fell into darkness. The air was surprisingly cool and wet, and the night was brighter now that he was outside the bag. He could see the trees around him, and the ground below as he fell toward it. He fell surprisingly fast, alarmingly fast, and for a moment he wondered if they had collectively made a calculation error out of their shared dislike for Danny. They knew, of course, that air resistance was always a factor in the speed of falling objects. In daily life, you didn't think about it, because most things in life presented similar air resistance. A 5-pound barbell and a 10-pound barbell would fall at the same rate. Same thing for a human being and an elephant. They'd fall at pretty much the same rate. But the students were now so small that air resistance did matter, and they had collectively guessed that the effect of air resistance would overcome the effect of mass. In other words, they would not fall at their full-size speed. They hoped. Now, with the wind whistling in his ears, tears blurring his eyes as he fell downward, Peter clenched his teeth and rubbed his eyes and tried to see where he was headed. He looked around and could not see any of the others falling through the air, though he heard a soft moan in the darkness. Looking back to the ground, he saw he was closing in on a broad-leafed plant, like a giant elephant ear. He tried to spread his arms wide and shift his position so he would hit the leaf in the center. He hit it perfectly. He smacked into the elephant's ear, cold, wet, slippery, and he felt the leaf bend beneath him, then rise back up and in a swift movement toss him back into the air like a tumbler on a trampoline. He yelled in surprise, and when he came down again, he landed near the edge of the leaf, spun, and slid on the water-slick surface down to the far tip, and fell. In darkness, he hit another leaf beneath, but it was hard to see down here, and he again rolled down toward the tip of the leaf. He clawed at the green surface, trying to halt his inevitable descent. It was to no avail. He fell, hit another leaf, fell, and finally landed on his back in a bed of wet moss, where he lay gasping and frightened, staring up at the canopy of leaves high above, which blotted out the sky. "You just going to lie there?" He looked over. It was Can King, standing over him. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No," he said. "Then get up." He struggled to his feet. He noticed she didn't help him. He was unsteady, standing in the wet moss, which leaked through his sneakers. His feet were cold and wet. "Stand over here," she said. It was as if she was talking to a child. He moved to stand beside her on a patch of dry ground. "Where are the others?" "Somewhere around here. It may take some time." Peter nodded. Looking at the jungle floor, from his new perspective half an inch above the ground. The jungle floor was incredibly rugged. Moss-covered stumps of rotted limbs rose like skyscrapers, and fallen branches, twigs really, made ragged arcs 20 or 30 feet above the ground. Even the dead leaves on the floor were larger than he was. And whenever he took a step, they shifted, moving around him and beneath his feet. It was like trying to move through a rotten organic junkyard. And of course, everything was wet. Everything was slippery and often slimy. Where exactly had they landed? They had been driven around for a long time. They could be anywhere on Oahu. Anywhere there was a forest, at least. Kim jumped up on a large twig, nearly fell off, got her balance, and sat on it, her legs dangling down. Then she put her fingers in her mouth and gave a piercing whistle. They should all hear that. She whistled again. Just then, something bulky and dark in color crunched out of the undergrowth. At first they couldn't see what it was, but the moonlight revealed a gigantic beetle, jet black, moving past in a sure-footed gait. His compound eyes gleamed faintly. It was covered with jointed black armor and had spiky hairs bristling from its legs. Karen drew her legs up respectfully as the beetle crawled below the twig she was pushed on. Erica Mole pushed her way out through a spray of plant stems, dripping wet. "Well," she said, "it's probably a Metrominus, a ground crawler. It doesn't fly. Don't disturb it. It's a carnivore. It's got jaws. And I'm sure it's got a nasty chemical spray too." They didn't want to get drenched with chemicals or become the beetle's next meal. They stopped talking and became very still while the beetle poked along, evidently hunting. Suddenly, the beetle charged forward, running remarkably fast, and seized something small in its jaws, which struggled, thrashing around. In the darkness, they couldn't see what the beetle had caught, but they could hear crunching sounds as it chopped up its prey. They got a whiff of something sharp and very nasty. "We are smelling the beetle's defensive chemicals," Erica Mole commented. "It's acetic acid. That's vinegar. And maybe decyl acetate. I believe the bitter stench is benzoquinine. The chemicals are stored in sacs in the beetle's abdomen. It may circulate in the beetle's blood too." They watched the beetle move off into the night, dragging its prey. "That's a superior evolutionary design. Better than ours, at least for this place," Erica added. "Armor jaws, chemical weaponry, and lots of legs," Peter said. "Yeah, way more legs." Erica said, most animals that walk the earth have at least 6 legs. As she knew, those additional appendages made maneuvering over rough terrain easier. All insects had 6 legs, and there were close to 1 million named insect species. Many scientists suspected that another 30 million insects were just waiting to be named, which made the insects the most varied life forms on Earth, apart from microscopic organisms such as viruses and bacteria. Insects, Erica said to the others, have been incredibly successful at colonizing the land areas of the planet. We think they look primitive, Peter said. We think fewer legs is a sign of intelligence, because we walk on 2 legs. We think it makes us smarter and better than any animal that walks on 4 or 6 legs. Karen pointed to the underbrush. Until we face this, and then we want more legs. They heard a scratching sound, and a rotund shape emerged from under a leaf. It looked like a mole, and was rubbing its nose with both hands briskly. This sucks, it said, spitting dirt. It still wore its tweed jacket, Danny. I never agreed to be half an inch tall, okay? Size matters. I already knew that. What are we going to do? For starters, you could stop whining, Karen said to Danny. We have to formulate a plan. We have to take stock. Take stock of what? Our weapons. Weapons? What's the matter with you two? We don't have any weapons, Danny said, starting to shout. We have nothing. That's not true, Karen said calmly. She turned to Peter. I've got a backpack. She jumped off the twig and grabbed the pack on the ground, lifted it up. I took it just before a twig shrunk us. Did Rick make it? Somebody asked. You bet, came a voice from the darkness, somewhere to their left. This doesn't faze me, and neither does the jungle at night. When I was doing research in the field in Costa Rica, that's Rick, Peter said. Anyone else? From above, there was a thwop, and the splatter of water droplets, and Jenny Lynn slid down a leaf and landed at their feet. You took your time, Ken said. Got caught on a branch about 10 feet up. I had to walk myself free, Jenny said. Jenny sat cross-legged on the ground and immediately jumped to her feet. Whoa, everything's wet. It's a rainforest, Ricardo said, emerging from foliage behind them. His jeans were drenched. Everybody okay? He grinned. How you doing, Danny boy? Fuck off, Danny said. He was still rubbing his nose. Oh, come on, Rick said. Get into the spirit of the thing. He pointed to the moonlight streaking down through the canopy of trees overhead. We are talking science studies. Isn't this the perfect Conradian moment? An existential confrontation of man facing raw nature? The real heart of darkness, unfettered by false beliefs and literary conceits? Somebody tell him to shut up. Rick, leave the guy alone, Peter said. No, not so fast, Rick said. Because this is important. What is it about nature that is so terrifying to the modern mind? Why is it so intolerable? Because nature is fundamentally indifferent. It's unforgiving, uninterested. If you live or die, succeed or fail, feel pleasure or pain, it doesn't care. That's intolerable to us. How can we live in a world so indifferent to us? So we define nature. We call it Mother Nature when it's not apparent in any real sense of the term. We put gods in trees and air and the ocean. We put them in our households to protect us. We need these human gods for many things: luck, health, freedom. But one thing above all, one reason stands out. We need the gods to protect us from loneliness. But why is loneliness so intolerable? We can't stand to be alone. Why not? Because human beings are children, that's why. But those are all disguises we create for our nature. You know how Danny loves to tell us that the science narrative privileges the balance of power. How there's no objective truth, except for who's got the power. Power tells the story, and everyone accepts it as truth, because power rules. He took a breath. But who's got the balance of power? Now, Danny, can you feel it? Take a deep breath. Feel it? No? Then I'll tell you. The balance of power lies in the hands of the entity that always holds the balance of power. Nature. Danny, not us. All we can do is go for the ride and try to hang on. Peter threw his arm around Rick and steered him away. That's okay for now, Rick. I hate that fucking guy, Rick said. We're all a little scared. Not me, Rick said. I'm cool. I love being half an inch tall. That's bite-sized for a bird. And that's what I am. I'm a freaking horse do-over for a minor bird. And my chances of surviving another 6 hours are about 1 in 4. Maybe 1 in 5. We must make a plan, Karen said, her voice calm. Amar Singh appeared around a log to the left, covered with mud, his shirt torn. He seemed remarkably calm. Peter asked, Everybody okay? They said they were. The Nanjing guy, Peter said. Hey, Kinski, are you around? All along, Gerald Kinski answered softly close by. He had been sitting underneath a leaf, his legs drawn up, motionless, and saying nothing, watching and listening to the others. Are you all right? Peter asked him. You want to keep your voices down, Kinski said, speaking to the students as a whole. They can hear better than we can. They, Jenny said, insects. Silence fell over the group. That's better, Kinski said. They began talking in whispers. Peter said to Kinski, Any idea where we are? I think so, Kinski answered. Look over there. They turned and looked. A distant light was shining in that direction, buried in the trees. The light cast a glow down along the corner of a wooden building, just visible through the foliage, and the light reflected off panes of glass. "That's the greenhouse," Kinski went on. "We're at the Waipaka Arboretum." "Oh God," Jenny Lynn said. "We are miles from Nana Jen." She sat down on a leaf and felt something moving under her feet. The movement went on, ceaselessly, nudging and bumping at her feet. And then something small crawled up her leg. She plucked it off and tossed it away. It was a soil mite, an 8-legged creature, and harmless. She realized that the soil was full of tiny organisms, all going about their business. "The ground is alive under our feet," she said. Peter Jansen knelt down, brushed a small worm from his knee, and faced Gerald Kinski. "What do you know about being shrunk like this?" "The term is dimensionally changed," Kinski answered. "I've never been dimensionally changed until now, of course. I've talked with the field teams. We're kind of broken. I wouldn't trust anything this guy says. He's loyal to Drake." "Wait," Peter said calmly. "What are the field teams?" he asked Kinski. "Nitrogen has been sending teams into the micro world. 3 people on a team," Kinski answered, in a whisper. He seemed very afraid of making noise. "They are dimensionally changed, half an inch tall. They operate the digging machinery and collect samples. They live in the supply stations." Jenny Lynn said. "You mean those tiny tents we saw?" "Yes. The teams never stay here for more than 48 hours. You begin to get sick if you stay changed for much longer than that." "Sick? What do you mean?" Peter asked. "You get the microbends," Kinski said. "Microbends?" Peter said. "It's an illness that develops in people who are dimensionally changed. The first symptoms appear in about 3 to 4 days. What happens?" "Well, we have some data on the disease. Not much." The safety staff began testing animals in the tensor generator. They shrank mice at first. They kept the shrunken mice in tiny flasks and studied them with a microscope. After a few days, all the shrunken mice died. The mice were hemorrhaging. Next, they shrank rabbits, and finally dogs. Again, the animals died with hemorrhages. Necropsies of the animals, after they'd been restored to normal size, showed that there were generalized bleeding at sites of injury. Small cuts bled profusely, and there was an internal bleeding as well. It was discovered that the blood of the animals lacked clotting factors. Essentially, the animals had died of hemophilia. That's the inability of the blood to form clots. We think that the size change disrupts enzymatic pathways in the clotting process, but we don't really know. But we also found that an animal could live for a short while in a shrunken state, as long as the animal was brought back to normal size within a couple of days. We began calling the illness microbends because it reminded us of the bends in scuba diving. As long as an animal's time in the shrunken state was limited, the animal seemed to be healthy. Next, there were several human volunteers, including the man who designed the tensor generator. His name was Rourke. I think humans could live for a few days in the micro world with no ill effects, it seemed. But then there was an accident. The generator broke down and we lost 3 scientists. They got trapped in the micro world and couldn't be returned to normal size. One of the fatalities was the guy who designed the generator. Since then, we've had other problems. If a person is stressed or suffers a major injury, the microbends can come on very suddenly and sooner than usual. So we have lost more employees. That's why Mr. Drake halted operations while we try to learn how to keep people from dying in the micro world. You see, Mr. Drake really does care about safety. What's the disease like in humans? Rick interrupted. Kinski went on. It begins with bruises, especially on your arms and legs. If you had a cut, you can bleed endlessly. It's like hemophilia. You can bleed to death from a small cut. At least that's what I'm hearing. But they're keeping the details pretty quiet, Kinski said. I just run the generator. Is there any treatment? Peter asked. The only treatment is decompression. Get the person restored to full size as soon as possible. We're in trouble, Danny murmured. We need to do an inventory of our assets now, Kevin said decisively. She laid the backpacks she grabbed in the generator room on top of a dead leaf. With only the moonlight to see by, she opened the pack and spread various things out on the leaf, as if it were a table. They gathered around and checked the contents carefully. The backpack contained a first aid kit, including antibiotics and basic medications, a knife, a short length of rope, a reel, rather like a fishing reel, which was attached to a belt, a windproof lighter, a silver space blanket, a thin waterproof tent, a water backpacker's headlamp. There was also a pair of headsets with throat mics attached to them. Those are two-way radios, Kinski said, for communicating with headquarters. There was also a very fine mesh ladder and keys or starter controls for some kind of machine, not present. Karen put everything but the lamp back into the pack and zipped it shut. Pretty useless, Karen said, getting to her feet and putting on the headlamp. She switched it on, casting the light around playing it over the plants and leaves. We really need weapons. Your light, please turn it off, Kinski muttered. It attracts things. What kind of weapons do we need? Amma asked Karen. Say, Danny interrupted, as if something had just occurred to him. Are there poisonous snakes in Hawaii? No, Peter said. There are no snakes at all. Not many scorpions either. Certainly not in the rainforest. It's too wet for them. Here, Ken King added. There is a Hawaiian centipede that can deliver a nasty sting to a human being. It could certainly kill us at our present dimension. In fact, a great many animals can kill us. Birds, toads, all sorts of insects, ants, wasps, and hornets. You were talking about weapons, Karen, Peter said. We need some kind of projectile weapon, Karen said. Something that can kill at a distance. A blowgun, Rick broke in. Karen shook her head. Nah, it would be 1/10 of an inch long. No good. Wait, Karen. I could use a hollow piece of bamboo. I could use it full size, 1/2 an inch long. Peter said, and a wooden dot to fit in it. Sure, Rick said. The dot sharpened by heat, Amma said, as the tempering agent, but for poison? Kara, Peter said, getting up, looking around. I bet lots of plants around here have. Rick interrupted. That's my specialty. If we could make a fire, we could boil bark and plant materials and extract poison. And especially if we can find some piece of metal, iron to make a dot point. My belt buckle, Amma said. And then what? Boil the stuff, then test it. That takes a long time. It's the only way. What about using the skin of a frog? Ilkamul said, in the night, they heard the croaking of what seemed to be bullfrogs all around them. Peter shook his head. We don't have the right kind here. What you're hearing are bufos, large toads. They're the size of your fist. Well, your old fists. They're gray, not brightly colored. They do manufacture unpleasant skin toxins. They're called bufotendins, not chiral-based compounds of the Central American. All right, for Christ's sake, Danny snapped. Just explaining. We get the picture. Ilka put her arms around Peter's shoulder, nodded to Danny. He was still fussing with his nose, scratching at it with both hands, holding them curled as if they were little paws, as if he were a mole. Cracking up, Ilka whispered fearfully. Peter nodded. Amma said, to continue the poison, you recommend. Watching Danny, Peter said, bark scrappings of Strychnos toxifera tree. Add oleander, sap, not leaf. Include Chondrodendron tomentorum, if it's available. Boil the mixture for at least 24 hours. Let's get started, Karen King said. We couldn't find these plants a lot more easily in the morning light, Jenny Lynn said. What's the rush? The rush, Karen said, is those halogen lamps back at the entrance. Right now, Vin Drake could be heading here to kill us. She swung the pack over her shoulders and tightened the straps. So, let's get started. Chapter 13. Alapuna Road, 29 October, 2 o'clock a.m. In bright moonlight, they hadn't much cover. The dense bush that clung to the cliffside stopped at the level of the dirt road, and it was only too easy to see the two cars driving along the narrow volcanic ridge. To the left, the land sloped down gently to agricultural fields. To the right, a steep cliff ended at crashing surf on the north shore of Oahu. Alison drove the first car, the Bentley convertible. Whenever she hesitated, Vin Drake waved her on from the second car, the BMW. They still had a distance to go to reach the washed-out bridge. Finally, he could see it in the moonlight, cream-colored concrete from the 1920s. Amazing it had lasted that long. Alison stopped and started to get out of the car. No, he said, waving her back in. You have to dress it. Dress it? Yes. The students are all jammed into the Bentley, remember. They're partying. He was carrying a laundry bag full of clothes and other items he'd collected from what the students had left in the front office and in the Bentleys parked at Nanogen. Several phones, shorts, t-shirts, bathing suits, a towel, a couple of rolled-up issues of Nature and Science, a tablet computer. She started tossing the things at random around the car. No, he said. Alison, please. We have to decide where everyone was sitting. I'm nervous. Very well. We still have to do it. It'll all get messed up when you push it over the cliff. Alison, we still have to do it. But the police, the bodies, will be missing. They won't be in the car. The water is full of rip currents and sharks. The sea swallows the dead. That's why we're doing it this way, Alison. Okay, she answered wearily. Who's back rear? Danny. She got out a sweater and a well-thumbed Conrad novel. Chance. Are you sure, Vin? Seems like a setup. Has his name in it? All right. Who's next to him? Jenny. She feels sorry for him. A delicate printed scarf. A belt of white python shoved back. Expensive. Isn't that illegal? Python, just in California. Then Peter Jansen's glasses appeared he was always losing. Ilka Mole's bathing suit and a pair of board shorts. They went on to finish dressing the front seat. with Kenny King driving. Then Vin Drake splashed lab alcohol over the back of the car, cracked the bottle, dropped it in the front, where it would catch under the dashboard. Don't want to overdo it. He looked around at the fleecy clouds in dark blue. The lights are far below. Beautiful night, he said, shaking his head. Beautiful world we live in. He walked to the left side of the car and surveyed it from a distance. There's a downslope just ahead, he said. Drive a few yards until you hit the downslope, and then you can get out and we can push the rest. Hey, Allison held up her hands. I don't want to get in there again, Vin. Don't be silly. We are talking 10 feet of driving. Just 10 feet. But what if something... Nothing will happen. Why don't you drive to the downslope, Vin? Allison, a firm eye in the darkness. I'm taller. I'd have to move the seat back. It will look suspicious in a police investigation. But we agreed. He opened the door for her. Come on now. She hesitated. We agreed, Allison. They got behind the wheel, shivering despite the evening warmth. Now, put up the top, he said. The top? Why? She asked. To keep everything in the car. She turned on the engine, pressed a button, and the Bentley's top rose and folded over. Vin stood some distance away, and with his hand indicated for her to move the car forward. The car tilted downward, slid a few feet. She yelped. Then it skidded to a stop. Okay, perfect, Vin said, reaching into his pocket for the nitrile lab gloves. Keep it there and park. Engine on. He came forward and she started to get out. She didn't hear the snapping sounds as he drew on the gloves. In a swift movement, he slammed the door shut, locked it, reached in through the window, and grabbed her by the hair with both hands. He slammed her head against the metal of the windshield frame, where there was less padding. She started to scream, but he pounded her head again and again. Then he banged her forehead on the steering wheel a few times to be sure. She was still conscious, but that wouldn't matter for long. He reached across her back and jerked the car into drive. It was awkward. He fell backward as the Bentley rolled past him, over the broken bridge, and then twisting, dropping 600 feet to the river and ocean below. Drake scrambled to his feet. He was too late to see the impact, yet he heard it. The rending of metal against stone. The convertible had landed upside down, and he watched for a while to see if there was any movement from beneath. One wheel spun loosely, but otherwise nothing. Trust is everything, Allison, he said softly, and turned away, peeling off the gloves. He had left his own car 100 yards back, and the dirt path was rock hard, dry, and it would take no tire impressions. He got in his car and backed slowly down the narrow path. No mistakes now. Until he found a space wide enough to turn his car around. Then he headed south, back to Honolulu. It would be several days before the police discovered the fallen car, and he should probably hurry things along. He'd call in the morning to report that his graduate students were missing, and he was worried about them. They'd been taken for a night on the town by the lovely Miss Allison's bender. As for wider publicity, reaching back to Cambridge and Boston, Ben Drake had a few fears. Hawaii would be helpful in this regard. Hawaii was a tourist destination, traditionally reluctant to report how many visitors died from rogue graves, strong surf, crumbling hiking trails, and other attractions of the beautiful outdoors. The Cambridge story would play for a few days, particularly since several of the kids were attractive, but inevitably it would be replaced by juicier fare. Austrian princess dies in helicopters skiing on Mount Rainier. Divers lost off Tasmania. Texas millionaire dies at Kombu base camp. Freak terror accident. Tourist eaten by giant Komodo lizard. There was always juicier news. It would pass. Of course, there would be difficulties inside the company itself. This visit was to have been a major addition to Nenajin staffing. A very needed addition too, because of the recent losses of staff, and therefore it would have been a major boost to his company. He would have to finance this matter with skill. The sports car scraped and lurched along the dirt road. He gripped the wheel firmly. He was heading south to Kenai Point, where souls leave the planet. And the surf raged up on both sides of the trail. He made a mental note to wash the salt water off his car and tires. Better to take it to a standard car wash over in Pearl City. He checked his watch. 3:30 a.m. Oddly enough, he felt no urgency, no nervousness. There was time enough to get back to the other side of the island, to Waikiki near Diamond Head, and time enough to check the kids' hotel rooms for artifacts, scientific objects they had brought with them, and then plenty of time for Vin to drive back to his own luxurious apartment on the Kahala side and slide into bed so he could awaken shocked to learn of the absurd behavior of his chief financial officer and the talented students she had led astray. Part 2. A Band of Humans. Chapter 14. Manoa Valley, 29 October, 4 o'clock a.m. The 7 students and Kinski walked through the forest, single file, listening, watching, steeped in darkness, in deep shadow, and enveloped in alien sounds. As Rick Carter moved along, stumbling his way among leaves on the ground, and scrambling under dead branches that seemed bigger than fallen redwoods. He held a homemade grass spear across his shoulder. Karen King wore the backpack and kept her knife gripped in her hand. Peter Jansen led the group on point, peering around, trying to pick a route. Somehow, in his quiet way, Peter Jansen had become the leader. They were not using the headlamp, for they didn't want to attract any predators. Peter couldn't see much of the terrain in front of him. "The moon has gone down," he said. "Dawn must be," Jenny Lind began. A terrible cry drowned her out. It began as a low wail and rose into a series of throaty shrieks, coming from the depths somewhere above. It was an eerie sound, dripping with violence. Rick spun around, holding his spear up. "What the hell was that?" "A bird singing, I think," Peter said. "We are hearing sounds at a lower pitch." He looked at his watch. 4:15 a.m. It was a digital watch. It was running normally, even when shrunk. "Dawn's coming," he said. "If we could find a supply station, we could try to call Nenajin on the radio," Jalakinsky suggested. "If they heard our signal, they would rescue us." "Drake would kill us," Peter said. Kinski didn't argue. But it was clear he didn't agree with Peter. Peter went on. "We have to get ourselves into the tensor generator so that we can be restored to full size. To do that, we have to get back to Nanjin somehow, but I think it would be a mistake to ask Drake for help." "Can we call 911? Danny broke in. "Great idea, Danny. Just tell us how Rick," said scornfully. Jalakinsky explained that the radios in the supply station only had a range of about 100 feet. If somebody from Nanjin is nearby and listening at the right frequency, they can communicate with us. Otherwise, nobody will pick up our signal. And the radios, he explained, didn't broadcast on any frequency that the police or emergency services used anyway. The Nanajin micro-sized radios broadcast at around 70 gigahertz, Kinski explained. That's a very high frequency. It works well for the field teams over short distances, but it's useless for long-distance communication. Jenny Lind said, "When Drake was showing us around the Arboretum, he mentioned there's a shuttle truck that goes to Nanajin from here, from Monora Valley. We could stow away on the truck." Everybody fell silent. Jenny had come up with what sounded like a good idea. Indeed, as they thought about it, Van Drake had mentioned a shuttle truck. But if the field teams had been withdrawn from the microworld, would the shuttle still be running? Peter turned to Gerald Kinski. Is the shuttle truck still making runs to Nanjing? Do you know? I don't know. What time does the truck normally arrive at the Arboretum? 2 o'clock, Kinski answered. Where does it stop? The parking lot. Next to the greenhouse. Everybody absorbed that, thinking about it. I think Jen's right. We should try to get on that truck, Peter said. Get ourselves back to Nanjing. Then try to get into the tensor generator. Wait. How the hell are we going to climb up onto a truck when we're this small? Ricardo demanded. He faced Peter Jansen. It's a crazy plan. What if there's no truck? Nanjing is 15 miles from here. We're 100 times smaller than we used to be. Think about it. It means that 1 mile is like 100 miles for us. If it's 15 miles from here to Nanjing, that's really like 1,500 miles for us. Basically, we have to do what Lewis and Clark did. And we have to do it in less than 4 days or we'll die of the bends. It's a shitty bet, guys. Rick's idea is to wring his hands and give up, Karen said. Rick turned on her angrily. We need to get practical. You're not being practical. You're whining, Karen said to him. Peter tried to defuse the argument. He put himself between Rick and Karen, figuring he could make himself a target of their wrath rather than let them continue to pick at each other. Please, he said, putting his hands on Rick's shoulder. Arguing isn't going to help anybody. Let's take things one step at a time. The group set off again, walking in silence. Half an inch tall, on the first floor, they had difficulty seeing much of anything, even as the sun rose. Ferns, thick and abundant, grew everywhere, and were especially difficult to deal with, for they blocked the view and created deep shadows. They lost sight of the greenhouse building and couldn't find any recognizable landmarks. Still, they kept moving. The sun broke forth and beams of light slanted through the forest canopy. In the daylight, they saw the soil more clearly. It was churning with small organisms, nematode worms, soil mites, and other little abundant creatures. This is what Jenny Lind had felt wriggling against her feet in the dark. The soil mites were very small, spider-like creatures of many different species, crawling around or hiding in cracks in the soil. The mice would have been almost invisible to the naked eye of a normal-sized person. But in relation to the microhumans, the soil mites were much larger. To the microhumans, the mites appeared to be anywhere from the size of grains of rice up to the size of golf balls. Many of the mites had small egg-shaped bodies, covered with thick armor and spiky hairs. The mice were arachnids, Ken King, the arachnologist kept stopping to gaze at them. She didn't recognize a single mite. They all seemed to be unknown. A vast number of different kinds of mites. She couldn't get over the richness of nature. Here was biodiversity as far as the eye could see. The mites were everywhere. They reminded her of crabs on a rocky seashore, small and harmless, busy and scuttling, carrying on their small, hidden lives. She picked up a mite and set it down on the palm of her hand. The creature seemed so delicate, so perfect. Karen felt her spirits lifting. What was going on? To her surprise, she realized that she felt happy in this strange new world. I don't know why, she said, but I feel like I've been searching all my life to find a place like this. It's like I'm coming home. Not me, Jenny said. The mite walked up Karen's arm, exploring it. Watch out, it could bite you, Jenny Lynn said. Not this little guy, Karen answered. See his mouth parts? They're adapted for sucking up detritus. Dead stuff. He eats crud. How do you know it's a he? Karen pointed to the mite's abdomen. Penis. A guy's a guy, no matter how small, Jenny remarked. As they hiked along, Karen grew animated. Mice are incredible. They're highly specialized. Many mites are parasites, and they're particular about their hosts. There's a kind of mite that lives only on the eyeballs of a certain fruit bat, nowhere else. There's another mite that lives only on the anus of a sloth. Please, Karen, Danny interrupted. Get over it, Danny. It's just nature. About half of all people on Earth have mites living in their eyelashes. Many insects get mites on them too. In fact, there are mites that live on other mites, so even mites get mites. Danny sat down and pulled a mite off his ankle. Little monster chewed a hole in my sock. Must be a detritus eater, Jenny said. That's not funny, Jenny. Anybody want to try my natural latex skin cream? Ricardo said. Maybe it'll keep the mites off. They stopped and Rick took out a plastic lab bottle and passed it around. They rubbed small amounts of the cream on their faces, hands, and cuffs. It had a pungent smell, and it worked. It did seem to repel mites. For Amar Singh, the reality of the microworld seemed to assault his senses. He noted that being small even changed the sensations he felt on his skin. His first impression of the microworld involved the feeling of air flowing over his face and hands, tugging at his shirt and ruffling his hair. The air seemed thicker, almost syrupy, and he could feel every ripple of breeze as the air coiled and flowed around his body. He raised his arm and felt the air sliding between his fingers. Moving through the air in the microworld was a bit like swimming. Because their bodies were so small, the friction of air passing over their bodies became more pronounced. Amos staggered a little, feeling a puff of air pushing him sideways. We are going to have to get our sea legs in this place, he said to the others. It's like learning how to walk all over again. The others were having similar difficulties, staggering, feeling the air tugging at them, and sometimes miscalculating the steps they took. Trying to jump up on something, they would jump too far. Their bodies were clearly stronger in the microworld, but they hadn't learned how to control their movements. It felt like moonwalking. We don't know our own strength, Jenny said. She gathered herself, leaped high, and grabbed the edge of a leaf in both hands. She hung by her hands for a moment. Then from only one hand, it was easy. She let go and fell back to the ground. Rick had her head, taking a turn, wearing the backpack. Though it was loaded with gear, he discovered he could jump up and down pretty easily, even with a pack on. And he got himself fairly high in the air without much effort. Our bodies are stronger and lighter in this world, because gravity's no big deal here. Small has its advantages, Peter remarked. I don't see them, Jenny Minot said. As for Amar Singh, a feeling of dread crept over him. What lived among these leaves? Meat eaters? They were many-legged animals with jointed armor and unusual ways to kill prey. Amar had been raised in a devout Hindu family. His parents, immigrants from India who'd settled in New Jersey, did not eat meat. He had seen his father open a window and chase a fly out rather than kill it. Amar had always been a vegetarian. He had never been able to eat animals for protein. He believed that all animals were capable of suffering, including insects. In the laboratory, he worked with plants, not animals. Now in the jungle, he wondered if he would have to kill an animal and eat its meat in order to survive, or whether an animal would eat him. We are protein, Amar said. That's all we are, just protein. What's that supposed to mean? Rick asked him. We are meat walking on two legs. You sound kind of gloomy, Amar. I'm being a realist. At least it's interesting, Jenny Lind remarked. Jenny noted the smell of the microworld. It had a smell all its own. A complicated earthy scent filled her nose, and it wasn't bad. Actually quite nice, in a way. It was an odor of soil mixed with a thousand unknown scents. Some sweat, some musky drifting in the liquid air. Many of the smells were pleasant, even lovely, like exquisite perfumes. We're smelling pheromones, the signaling chemicals that animals and plants use for communications, Jenny said to the others. It's the invisible language of nature. It lifted her spirits. Here, she could experience the full spectrum of sense in the natural world for the first time. This revelation both thrilled her and made her feel afraid. Jenny held a chunk of soil up to her nose and sniffed it. It was teeming with tiny nematodes worms, and numerous mites, and several plump little creatures called water bears. And it smelled faintly like antibiotics. She knew why the soil was full of bacteria, and many of the bacteria were different kinds of streptomyces. You can smell streptomyces, Jenny said to the others. They're one of the types of bacteria that make antibiotics. Modern antibiotics are derived from them. The soil was also laced with thin threads of fungus known as hyphae. Jenny pulled a fungal thread out of the soil. It was stiff but slightly stretchy. A cubic inch of soil could hold several miles of these threads of fungus. Something drifted past Jen's eyes, falling downward through the thick air. It was a small nugget the size of a peppercorn, studded with knobs. "What on earth is that?" she said, stopping in her tracks to watch it. The nugget landed at her feet. Another fell slowly past. She put out her hand and caught it in her palm, then rolled it between thumb and forefinger. It was tough and hard, like a small nut. "It's pollen," she said with wonder. She looked up. There was a hibiscus tree overhead, bursting into a profusion of white flowers, like a cloud. For some reason she could not explain, her heart leaped at the sight of it. For a few moments Jenny Lind felt glad to be very small. "I think it's kind of wonderful here," Jenny said, turning slowly around, looking up at the clouds of flowers, while a steady snow of pollen fell around her. "I never imagined this." Jenny, we need to keep moving." Peter Jensen had stopped to wait for her, and was shepherding people along. As for Erica Mole, the entomologist, she did not feel happy at all. She was experiencing a growing sensation of fear. She knew enough about insects to be extremely afraid of them right now. "They have armor, and we don't," Erica thought. "Their armor is made of chitin. It's bioplastic armor, light and super tough." She ran her fingers over her arm, feeling the delicacy of her skin. The downy hair was soft. She thought, we're edible." She didn't say anything to the others, but felt a choking sense of terror seething below the surface of her calm. She was afraid her fear would betray her, that she would lose control of herself in a panic. Erica Mole compressed her lips and clenched her hands, and trying to keep her fear under control, kept walking. Peter Jensen called for a halt. They rested sitting on the edge of leaves. Peter wanted to pick Gerald Kinski's brain. Kinski knew a lot about the tensor generator, since he operated it. If they could somehow get themselves back to Nanogen, and could get themselves inside the tensor generator room, would they be able to operate the machine? How would they do it? If they were tiny, Peter asked Kinski, would we need to get help from a normal-sized person to run the machine? Kinski looked doubtful. I'm not sure, he said, and poked at the ground with a grass spear. I heard a rumor that the man who designed the tensor generator put a small-sized emergency control in it that a micro-human can operate. I presume this tiny control panel is somewhere in the control room. I've looked for it, but I've never found it. There's nothing in the engineering drawings either. But if we could find the tiny control panel, I can operate it. We'll need your help, Peter said. Kinski lifted the spear from the soil and gazed at a mite that walked along the spear, waving its forelegs. All I want is to get home to my family, he said softly, and shook his spear, tossing the mite away. Your boss couldn't care less about your family, Ricardo snapped at Kinski. Rick doesn't have a family, Danny Minot whispered to Jenny Lynn. He doesn't even have a girlfriend. Rick lunged at Danny, who scrambled away, shouting, You can't solve a problem with violence, Rick. It would solve you, Rick muttered. Peter took Rick by the shoulder and squeezed it, restraining him, as if to say, Stay cool. To Kinski, he said, Aren't there any other possibilities for getting back to an engine besides the shuttle truck, which might not exist? Kinski bowed his head, thinking. After some time, he said, Well, we could try to get to Tantalus Base. What's Tantalus Base? It's a bioprospecting facility in Tantalus Crater, on the mountain ridge above this valley. Kinski pointed vaguely toward the mountain, which was only a green shape barely visible through gaps in the tangled forest. The base is somewhere up there, Jenny Lynn said. Finn Drake mentioned Tantalus during the tour. I remembered, Cannon said. Is the base open? Peter asked Kinski. I don't think so. People died at Tantalus. They were predators. What kind? Cameron demanded. Wasp, I heard. But, Kinski went on musingly, there were microplanes at Tantalus Base. Microplanes? Small aircraft our size. Could we fly to an engine? I don't know what the range of these aircrafts is, Kinski answered. I don't know if any of them were left at the base. How far above us is Tantalus Base? It's 2,000 feet above Manoa Valley, Kinski answered. 2,000 feet up, Ricardo exploded. That's impossible for people our size. Kinski shrugged. The others said nothing. Peter Jensen took charge. Okay, here's what I think we should do. First, let's try to find a supply station and take what we can from it. Then we'll try to get to the parking lot. We'll wait there for the shuttle truck. We have to get back there as soon as possible. It's obvious we are going to die, Danny Minot said, his voice cracking. We can't just do nothing, Danny, Peter said, trying to keep his voice even sounding. He sensed Danny could break down into a panic at the drop of a hat, and that would be dangerous for the whole group. The others went along with Peter's plan, some of them grumbling, but nobody had a better idea. They took turns drinking water from a dewdrop on a leaf and began moving again, looking for a trail and a tent or any trace of human presence. Small plants near the ground arced over them, sometimes forming tunnels. They wound their way through the tunnels and wandered past the trunks of stupendous trees. But there was no sign of a supply station. Okay, so we're going to bleed to death if we don't get the hell out of here fast, Rick had said, as they hiked along. And we can't find a damn supply station. Plus, we've got a psychopathic giant looking to kill us. And I've got a blister. Is there anything else I need to worry about? He asked, sounding very sarcastic. Ants, Kinski replied calmly. Ants? Then Minot broke in, his voice quavering. What about ants? Ants are a problem, I've heard, Kinski answered. Ricardo stopped in front of a large yellow fruit lying on the ground. He looked up and all around. Yes, he said, that's a chinaberry tree. Melea asderak. The berry is highly poisonous, especially to insects and insect larvae. It contains around 25 different volatiles, principally one cinnamyl compounds. This berry is absolute death to insects. It can be an ingredient for my cereal. He took off the backpack and stuffed the chinaberry into it. The berry filled much of the pack and loomed out of the top of the pack, a bright yellow ovoid, sort of like a giant melon. Karen glanced at him. It's going to leak poison. Nope, Rick grinned and tapped on the yellow berry, tough skin. Karen gave Rick a skeptical look. It's your life, she said curtly. The group moved on. Danny Matt kept falling behind. His face had gotten red, and he kept wiping his forehead with his hands. Finally, he took off his sport coat and threw it to the ground. His tassel loafers had gotten coated with mud. He sat on the leaf and started scratching inside his shirt and pulled out a single pollen grain and held it between thumb and forefinger. Does anybody know I have serious allergies? If one of these objects gets up my nose, I could go into shock. Ken gave a scornful laugh. You aren't that allergic. If you were, you'd be dead by now. Danny flicked it away, and the grain danced off, spinning as it drifted through the air. Amos Singh couldn't get over the profusion of life. The small creatures that seemed to exist in every nook and cranny of the micro world. Gosh, I wish we had a camera. I want to document this. They were young scientists, and the micro world revealed a wonderful of unknown life. They suspected they were seeing creatures that had never been noticed or given names. You could get a dissertation out of every square foot of this place, Amma remarked. He began thinking he would do just that. He could get himself one incredible PhD out of this trip. If I survive, he reminded himself. Little torpedo-shaped creatures with jointed bodies and 6 legs were crawling about on the ground. They were quite small and were all over the place. Some were sucking up strands of fungus, as if they were eating spaghetti. As the humans walked along, every now and then one of these creatures would get startled, make a loud snapping noise, and flip high into the air, spinning end over end. Elkamol stopped to examine one of them. She picked it up and held it, while it struggled, snapping its tail with vigorous clicking sounds. "What are these things?" Rick asked, pulling one out of his hair. "They're called springtails," Erica Mole said. "In the normal world," she explained, "springtails are extremely small, no bigger than the dot over an I on a page of text." She said the animal had a spring mechanisms in its abdomen. She explained that propelled it long distance, helping it escape from predators. As if on cue, the springtail flung itself off her hand, soaring into the air and out of sight beyond a fern. Springtails kept bouncing into the air as they moved along, disturbed by their footsteps. Peter Jansen led the way. Sweat dripped from his body. He realized their bodies were losing moisture fast. "We need to make sure we drink enough water," he said to the others. "We could dry out really fast." They found a clump of moss hung with droplets of dew, and they gathered around it. They drank from dewdrops, cupping the water in their hands. The surface of the water was sticky, and they had to swat the water to break the surface tension. As Peter lifted a bit of water to his mouth, it heaped up into a blob in his hands. They came to a massive tree trunk. It soared up from a sprawling buttress of roots. As they worked their way around the roots, a sharp smell became apparent. They began to hear thrumming, tapping sounds, like rain falling. Peter, who was leading the way, climbed on top of a root and came in sight of a pair of low walls, snaking across the ground and out of sight. The walls were made of bits of dirt, stuck together with some kind of dried substance. Between the walls, a column of ants was moving, streaming in both directions. The walls protected an ant highway. In one spot, the walls extended into a tunnel. Peter crouched down and motioned to the others to stop. They moved forward cautiously until they were lying on their stomachs and looking down on the ant column. Were the ants dangerous? Each ant was nearly as long as his forearm. Not that big, Peter thought, and he felt relieved, for somehow he had expected ants to be much larger than this. But there were certainly a lot of them. They flowed swiftly by the hundreds along the road and through the little tunnel they'd built. Their bodies were reddish-brown in color and prickly with hair. Their heads were shining black as coal. The odor of the ants drifted from the ant highway like exhaust coming from freeway traffic. The smell was tart and acidic, yet perfumed with a delicate fragrance. That sharp smell is formic acid. It's a defense. Erkamol explained as she knelt down, watching the ants with great intensity. Denny Lynn said, "The sweet smell is a pheromone. It's probably the colony scent. The ants use that scent to identify each other as members of the same colony." Erica continued, "They're all females. They're all daughters of their queen." Some of the ants were carrying dead insects or pieces of dismembered insects. The food carriers were all traveling in the same directions, along the highway toward the left. The nest entrance is that way. It's where they're carrying the food, Erica added, pointing to the left. "Do you know the species?" Peter asked her. Erica searched her mind for the name. Hawaii doesn't have any native ants. All ants in Hawaii are invading species. They've arrived here with humans. I'm pretty sure those ones are Phyodol megacephalia. Do they have a name in English? Rick asked. "I'm just an ignorant ethnobotanist." "It's called the big-headed ant." Erica went on. "It was found originally on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, but it's now spread all over the world. It's the most common ant in Hawaii. The big-headed ant had turned out to be one of the most destructive invasive insects on the planet," Erica explained. "The big-headed ants have done a lot of damage to the ecosystems of these islands," she said. "They attack and kill native Hawaiian insects. They've nearly wiped out some Hawaiian insect species. They also kill nesting baby birds." "That doesn't sound good for us," Ken said. A baby bird, she realized, would be much larger than they were as microhumans. "I don't see what's big about their heads," Denny remarked. Edgar said, "These ones are minor workers. The majors have the big heads." "Majors?" Denny asked nervously. "What are they?" "The majors are soldiers," Edgar went on. "The big-headed ant has two castes, minors and majors. The minors are workers. They are small and plentiful. The majors are the warriors, the gods. They're large and uncommon." "So what do the big-headed soldiers look like?" Edgar shrugged. "Big heads?" There were so many ants, and each ant seemed filled with inhuman energy. One ant by itself certainly did pose a danger, but thousands of them, excited, hungry, despite the threat, the young scientists couldn't help gazing at the ants with fascination. Two ants stopped and tapped their antennae together, and then one of the ants began wagging its rear end and making a rattling sound. The other ant obligingly vomited a droplet of liquid into the other's mouth parts. Erica explained what was going on. She was begging food from a nestmate. She wagged her rear end and made those scratchy sounds to say she was hungry. It's the ant's versions of a dog's whine. Denny interrupted. "I fail to see the joy of watching an ant blow lunch into another ant's mouth. Let's go, please." The ant highway wasn't very wide. They could have easily jumped over it. but they decided to avoid the ant column rather than risk trouble. As Peter put it, we don't want an ant to latch onto someone's ankle. Gerald Kinski had stopped, and he was staring up at the branches of the great buttress tree, which soared over their heads. "I know this tree," he said. "It's a giant albagia tree. There's a supply station on the other side of it, I'm pretty sure." He clambered up onto a root and walked along the root for a distance and hopped down. "Yes," he said. "I think we're getting close." Kinski took over the lead from Peter and began heading towards the left, around the albagia tree. Pushing his way through dead ferns, leaves, striking at things with a grass stem spear, knocking leaves and plants aside, Peter Jansen dropped back to the rear. He had not liked the look of the ants and wanted to keep an eye on them as the group moved along. Rick Hyder was the last in line, moving slowly with a pack on his back, carrying the chinaberry and holding his spear. "Hey, Rick, can I take your spear for a while?" "I'll bring up the rear," Peter said. Rick nodded, handed him the spear, and kept walking. Kinski, meanwhile, dragged a leaf aside and said loudly, "If we can get back to Nanajin, we'll have to find the hidden console so we can operate the generator, even if Mr. Drake doesn't want." At that moment, Gerald Kinski froze in his tracks. Ahead in the distance, beyond the roots of the tree, stood the peak of a tent. A station, Kinski shouted, and he started running toward the tent. He didn't see the entrance of the ant's nest. It was an artificial tunnel, fashioned from bits of glued dirt, emerging from the base of the palm tree. Kinski ran right past the tunnel mouth. Standing around the tunnel, in guard positions, were dozens of big-headed soldiers' ants. The soldiers were 2 to 3 times larger than the workers. Their bodies were dull red, covered with sparse, bristly hair. Their heads were gleaming black and massively oversized, packed with muscles and plated with armor, and fitted with mandibles designed for fighting. Their eyes were black marbles. They spotted Kinski's as he ran toward the tent. Instantly, all the soldiers charged. Kinski noticed the giant ants running towards him, and he swerved, but the soldiers had fanned out. They converged on Kinski's, coming from different directions, a strategy that cut off his escape. Kinski stopped running and backed up inside a closing ring of ants soldiers, holding his grass spear over his head. "No," he shouted. He slashed at a soldier with the spear, but the ant grabbed the spear in its mandibles and broke off its point. Several soldiers darted in and began to pull Kinski's to the ground, while one ant closed in its mandibles around Kinski's wrist. He shouted and shook his hand, whirling the ant around, trying to make it let go. But the ant had clamped on his wrist and was shaking its head, bulldogging Kinski. His hand came off, and the ant flew away and hit the ground running, with a hand in his mandibles. Kinski screamed and went down on his knees, cradling his severed wrist, which spouted blood. A soldier climbed up Kinski's back, fastened its jaws behind his ear, and began tearing off Kinski's scalp. Kinski fell to the ground writhing. Within moments, the soldiers had him spread-eagled, and were pulling on his arms and legs from different directions. They were drawing and quartering the man, attempting to tear him limb from limb. A soldier got his mandibles fastened under his chin, and his screams ended with a guttural noise as blood spurted from his throat and drenched the ant's head. Smaller workers joined the attack, and Kinski's seemed to disappear under a pile of frantic ants. Peter Jansen had run forward, waving a spear, shouting at the ants, trying to drive them off Kinski, but it was too late. Peter stopped and stood his ground before the mass of struggling soldiers, holding the spear and watching the horror. He could buy time for the others to get away, he thought, and he started advancing toward the ants. Then he noticed that Ken King stood beside him, holding her knife. "Get out of here," Peter said to her. "No," she said to him. She crouched, facing the ants, holding her knife in front of her. She could delay the ants, maybe give the others time to escape. Meanwhile, more soldiers poured out of the nest. They began hunting around, seeking enemies. A soldier raced toward Peter and Karen, his mandibles wide. Peter thrust his spear at the ant. The ant dodged it and went for him, moving extremely fast. "Leave me, Peter," Ken King shouted. She backed away from the ants. Then she leaped into the air, soaring far higher than a normal human could ever jump, and landed cat-like away from the ants. At the same time, she pulled from her belt the spray bottle of defensive chemicals that she'd planned to show to Vin Drake. Benzos? Ants didn't like benzos. She was pretty sure of that. She sprayed the stuff towards an advancing ant. The ant stopped instantly, turned around, and ran away. "Yeah," she yelled. "The spray worked. It made them run like rabbits." One of the corner of her eye, she could see the others running away from the ant nests. Good, buying them time. She kept spraying, and the spray held the ants back, stopped their attacks, but the bottle had contained only a small amount of the liquid, and still more soldier ants were breaking out of the nest. The nest had gone into full alarm. An ant leaped up onto Karen, landing on her chest, tearing her shut, and it began snapping at her neck. "Hi!" she shouted and grabbed the ant behind its head, held it up in the air, and with her other hand slammed her knife into the ant's head. The blade punched through the ant's head, and a clear liquid squirted out. It was hemolymph, insect blood. Instantly, she flung the ant away. It landed on the ground and went into convulsions, its brain destroyed. But the ants had no fear, no sense of self-preservation, and there seemed to be no end to their numbers. As the ants closed in on her, Karen jumped away, soaring head over heels, backwards like a circus tumbler, and again landed on her feet, and then she ran. Ahead of her, she saw the other humans running explosively fast, driven by fear, leaping over leaves and fern stems, dodging things, fleeing like gazelles. How can I run this fast? I've never run so fast in my life, Ken thought. Clearly, their bodies were much stronger and faster in the micro world. It gave Ken a feeling of superhuman power and exhilaration. She leaped over obstacles like a hurdle runner, clearing things in a series of incredible jumps. She realized she was sprinting at about 50 miles an hour. In the scale of the microworld, I killed an ant with a knife in my bare hands. They soon got out of the visual range of the ants. Ahead in the distance stood the tent. Rocket ants continued to butcher Kinski's body. They bit off the arms and legs and cut the torso into chunks, making cracking sounds as they sheared through the ribs and spine, yanking out the man's viscera. The ants drank the spilled blood, making sucking noises. A welter of torn clothing, blood, and intestines was strewn about, while the ants began transporting the meat underground. Kenneking stopped running for a moment to look back, and she saw the ants carry Kinski's head down the hole. The severed head steered back as it went down. Pulled by workers, it seemed to hold a look of surprise.